The Five Rings Podcast, your weekly amateur sports and Olympic sports show with Duane and Kevin Laramie. And now, without further ado, here's Duane Rollins.
And welcome to the Five Rings Podcast. I am Duane Rollins here, and starting to get a little warmer, Toronto. Not quite there, Toronto, but spring, I wouldn't say is in the air, Kevin, but it's no longer hell.
We're seeing the light at the end of the long and really, really harsh and cold tunnel, Duane.
Yes, for those that understand Celsius, it's +7 with a little bit of a wind chill to make it feel like +4 here in Toronto. But after the last few weeks, 2 days ago was the first day over freezing in the city of Toronto since January 18th. So you can understand that we're like walking around sunbathing in +7, even if there's a -3 wind chill involved in it. So, here we are.
I saw people in shorts, Duane. I just came back from doing some errands this morning and seeing people in shorts walking outside. I think it's a relief on society in general in the Northeast right now.
Yeah, I saw legs for the first time on the subway in a few months the other
Hope they
day,
weren't
too.
mine.
No, they weren't yours. They'd be a long way from home. At any rate, this is your weather report brought to you by the Five Rings Podcast. We're also going to talk today about the No Boston Olympics and the Boston Olympics movement. It's got some numbers to talk about here. We're going to talk a little bit about how people oppose and promote Olympics and how bias and sort of partisanship gets wrapped up in this, and how we're just frustrated about how we can't have a fair conversation on both sides of the issue. So we're going to talk about that. We have some video, some clips from some videos that have been promoted by both the No Boston Olympics and the Boston 2024 people that we're going to show out there and talk a bit about today in our second segment. But in our middle segment, we're going to talk about the U17 World Cup, which is in Chile in the fall. There's 12 teams have qualified. There's going to be another 4 in the next few months, including the region that Kevin and I are in Concacaf. So we'll briefly touch on that. And the the last major women's build-up events, the big last tournaments before the World Cup are taking part. The finals are taking place right now. The finals are right now. They are Algarve and the Cyprus finals. Canada is in one. The U.S. is in the other. We'll talk briefly about that, and then we'll wrap it up with what are we going to talk about in our final segment, Kevin?
Well, I guess because we have to, because it's the end of the season and the World Championships are coming soon, and because you watched a lot of that sport in the last 2 weeks, I guess you're going to talk about curling.
Hurry hard. Hurry hard. Yeah, no, it's the Briar wrapped up. So we'll talk about that. The World Junior Championships were last week, and the World's Women's Championship starts on Thursday, and the men start 2 weeks after that. So it is a busy time in the world of curling. We will continue to have our Duane Talks Curling for the next couple podcasts, probably.
And just quickly, before we move on to talk about other stuff, Duane, there was a couple of good results in the skiing, too. Skiing is alpine skiing, downhill, giant slalom, and Super G. A couple of Canadian did a couple of podium the last couple of weeks, so that's interesting as well.
Absolutely. I love the skiing. Steve Poborski, as I think I've talked about that before, one of my childhood heroes, the world's women's. He's not a woman, he's a man.
Yeah, and he's a real man.
Yeah, he used to put planks on his feet and go really fast down a mountain. He's a World Downhill World Cup champion, and he's from Don Mills, Ontario, which is just around the corner from where I'm sitting right now, and it has no mountains.
Flat as a pancake.
No mountains. Anyway. All right, let's take a quick break, come back, and we'll talk a little bit about the Boston Olympics. And welcome back to the Five Rings Podcast. As I said before the break, we're going to have a little conversation now about the Boston Olympics, both from the pro group and the con group perspective, and talk a little bit about the strategies and how that plays out and what we think is fair and not fair about that. But before we do that, Kevin, we have started an initiative here on the Five Rings Podcast and also on the Two Solitudes Podcast, for those that listen to that, to try and raise a little bit of money to support the podcast, to help us be better and to provide more content for you. And just to cover our costs a little bit, Patreon is something that a lot of people are used to and understand, and is a really simple thing to use. You just make a pledge of whatever you feel comfortable doing. We have $10 as our default one, but if you can afford less, obviously we're going to accept that, and thank you for that.
It could be a quarter, it could be 50 cents, it could be 75 cents, but it's really easy. You just go to patreon.com/2solitudes5rings. You get all the details. There's some rewards included, but there's simple rewards where we'll be entirely gratified to you forever just for supporting us, trying to give us some support to live our passion, to be able to give you the information that we try to get every single day, and to go deeper into the coverage of all the sports that you love, soccer, all the world events, Olympics. With the Pan Am game coming this summer, we want to be more involved on the field, on the sidelines of those games. So with that, we do need your support, but we are thankful for your support so far.
Exactly. We're not going to go any deeper right now. Content is king. It will allow us to give you more content. I'll leave it at that. We'll get those links out in the description to the podcast, in our Twitter, on our Facebook, and so on and so forth. So whatever you can do, we appreciate. On that note, Kevin, let's move on and talk about the Boston Olympics. And there's some interesting stuff here in the last couple of days that have come out, particularly on the financial side of things, both from the Boston 2024 bid folks, which the Boston Bid Committee stands for BBC, which is my new favorite acronym anyway. So the Boston Bid Committee has got some promotional videos and things that have come out in the last few days. There also has been sort of a pushback against the No Boston Olympic folks. We, of course, had Chris Dempsey on the show, and we do thank him for that. Maybe we'll get Chris back on here in the days to come. He is front and center this week, sort of defending No Boston Olympics policy of not releasing their donor list, not letting people know where their money comes from, which on the surface is completely legal. It is absolutely above board. They are not required to do so, and we need to stress that. But from a optics perspective, when one of their main demands is transparency from the Boston 2024 people, it has caused a bit of a pushback this week. And there have been a few articles written that have sort of suggested or implied that maybe this is hypocritical of the No Boston Olympics people. And that's where we'll start this conversation today. And I guess, Kevin, I'll ask you, do you think that that's something they should do?
Yes, but what I'm wondering is why don't they want? Is there a reason why not to reveal the donor list, or maybe just by principle? If it's by principle, I can get behind that. No worries. If there's reason, if it's to hide something because of that's a totally a different ball game, and then my opinion on it would change. I would really like to see transparency on both sides, because that's what they're saying. If you're asking for your opposite camp, the opposition, your opponent, in a way, because it does look like a political battle, because that's what it's becoming. So on the political side of thing, I'll use some political terminology. If the people on the other side of the assembly saying A, and you want to counterpoint this, you need to show example. You need to lead by example, concrete facts, concrete efforts, and concrete what's the word that I'm forgetting right now? It doesn't matter. But with concrete evidence on your side that you're really behind that issue. Their issue that they're clamoring for is transparency, and they want the BBC to be open to the public and to be transparent. And the first controversy we hear about the No Boston Committee, well, they are not. So I think there's an expression that your boots need to be at the same pace as your lips, and right now that's not the case.
That sounds like a fun expression. I'll give you what Chris Dempsey said to the press in Boston was that the reason they're not revealing who their donors are is because they weren't. Those donors made those donations, in his opinion, in the opinion of No Boston Olympics, with the possibility that they'd be anonymous. They weren't. It wasn't made clear that they'd be disclosed because they're not required to, again, by law. And again, I stress that there's nothing unbetold happening here. Like, No Boston Olympics is under no obligation to release this. It would just be an optical thing for them to do so. They would suggest that maybe there are people. I think the implication was that there are people in high ranking that maybe work for companies that support the games, that work under politicians that support the games, that are supporting the No Boston Olympics, and they don't want to have their name public because there might be a reprisal to that. That is what they said. So that's the other side of it. It's a tricky thing, though, as you said, because it's they're asking for one thing and not getting another thing. Or not doing it, I should say. The other point that they make out is it's, you're talking about billions of dollars on one side, they suggest, and, nickel and dime mom and pops on the other side, and mom and pops should be held to a different accord. And I'll tell you, as a trained journalist, as someone who went to journalism school, they do teach that you treat, professional public sources differently than you treat private sources. So if you're interviewing a person who witnessed a crime or is involved in some kind of story in some way that's not normally in the media, you have different sort of ethics involved in how you treat them than you do with someone who constantly deals with the media in terms of how, like, off record, for instance. If you're talking to a public.
No,
Yeah,
I
go
agree.
ahead.
You're not going to paint somebody in a corner. You're not going to try to squeeze somebody and make them look bad when they're not used to being interviewed, right? Because it's one of your... When you're interviewing somebody that's used to it, you can ask questions that go deeper into a said subject that you can't really do when you're interviewing somebody that's not used to be in that setting.
Yeah, for instance, I was talking off record. Off record is kind of a gray topic in the world of journalism. You hear it used a lot, but there's really no such thing when you're talking to a journalist if you identify it. Ethically there isn't. They teach you that if you use off the record strategically as a journalist to get more information, as background information is what you'll call it. We'll have a background conversation where you don't use them, and it's in your benefit as a journalist to not reveal your source in those cases, so you get more information from them. But when you're talking to just Joe Blow and the public, everything you say, you need to be clear to them that you're on or off the record, and you need to respect that because they're not used to dealing with it. When you're talking with a public figure or a PR professional, they know exactly what's going on. They're playing the game equally, right? So they understand the game and all that. We're getting a little off topic, but I think it's sort of just what we're talking about here when we're talking about donations. If it truly is with No Boston Olympics $10 and $20 donations that are adding up to their support, and they don't want to reveal the people that are giving the $10 and $20 donations, I don't actually have an issue with that. I think that's probably fair. But if you're talking about big major like $100,000 donations, $20,000 donations, or whatever, then maybe it would be in their best interest from a strategic point anyway to release those names and have it up front so that the conversation's honest. And I think that's what everyone on both sides of this issue should be striving for, is an honest conversation.
But you know what bothers me a little, Duane, is once again, we're not even actually talking about the real issues. We're just being pedantic and talking about semantics and funding. We're not talking about the real reason why Boston should or shouldn't get those Olympics.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to it's a partisan battle, and they simplify things to try and get their point across. I think this is a good point, Kevin. We have two clips that we're going to run here, which are advertisements, basically. That the first one you're going to hear is an advertisement that the Boston 2024 people are running. It's a pro-Olympics commercial. It has nice, uplifting music in it. It talks about how great it would be to have this high level of competition in Boston. Then the second one you'll hear after, there'll be a bit of a lull there, and you'll hear the second one come in, and it's a Streeter interview from the No Boston Olympics, and I'll let it speak for itself, but it's obviously against the idea of having the Olympics. So run those clips, runs about 2.5 minutes total for both of them in here right now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a bit about the strategies that they're using to try and manipulate their opinion out for the greater masses, and whether we think that's a fair way to approach this conversation.
I was quite excited when I first heard that the Olympics were potentially coming to Boston. I was even more excited when we won the ability to represent the United States potentially in the Olympics in 2024.
Boston is a great place to have the Olympics because it would put Boston in the map in Massachusetts.
I've been to 10 Paralympic Games and Olympic Games sites, and this, it's so invigorating.
Boston would be ideal as the combination of the spirit of America, the universities, Harvard, MIT, Boston University, UMass Boston, but most of all the humanity that you can get through sport participation. And the best place, the best platform is going to be the Olympic Games in 2024.
And I think the part of sport, the competition, the values that it engenders, I think it's so important, for everyone. And just to be a small part of this, to contribute in some way to it, I'm really looking forward to it.
I envision a much more comprehensive look at the sport legacy for the kids.
It is something that you cannot easily describe in words, but it fulfills you for life.
Do you support more affordable housing or creating a velodrome?
I'm sorry, what was the last part there?
A velodrome.
A velodrome. What exactly do you mean by that? Which do I think is more important?
Yeah, affordable housing or velodrome.
That's a tough one.
Do you think Boston or the region needs a velodrome?
I don't know what a velodrome is, but sounds unnecessary by the title.
Do you know what a velodrome is?
No. That would be good to know.
What do you think it is?
I don't know. It just sounds very expensive and very big.
It is a cycling stadium.
I guess, well, now that I know that, I would definitely say affordable housing would seem like it would be a little bit more top priority than a cycling stadium.
I mean, I'm not really big into cycling stadiums myself, so I'd say affordable housing.
Affordable housing?
Yeah.
That seems like a no-brainer to me.
And welcome back. First off, those interviews, you can't see the video there. They're done at the university campuses. And I just have to say that if you don't know what a velodrome is and you're going to university, educate yourself, okay? Because it's not that complicated of a word. That irritated me a little bit. At any rate.
First of all, even if you don't know what it is, you'll be able to break down the word and understand what it is. You know what a velo is and you know what the suffix drome is. You would be able to figure it out if you are going to Harvard for all the places.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. Well, I wanted to talk a bit about. I mean, this is propaganda on both sides of the issue, is what it is, right? It's propaganda. They absolutely are using emotion and their humor in some cases. With that second video, they're using a little bit of like humorous condescension, mocking sort of stuff to try and get their political point of view. This is old school politics 101. They're talking about an Olympics bid in this particular case, but they could be talking about anything: healthcare, education, anything to try and get their point across. And the subtlety is simply not there because they're treating this like an election. They're attack ads, or, well, the first one isn't an attack ad, the second one is an attack ad. And it's exactly the same way they run an election. And that, to me, is not the way to have these conversations. And I don't know how to make that better, because you can't have everyone in Boston listen to podcasts like ours or listen to have like long-winded, thought-provoking articulated arguments out there. There is an element of snark and snip that has to go through to get the point across. Anyway,
no, you're absolutely right, but it does seem biased just because on both sides. If you're looking at the pro one, the first one we heard, if you couldn't see the video, but on the video it's clear that they're all at the same location while they're recording all their little tidbits. That tells you that they've been chosen and all been in the same place at the same time, which means that people seeked out people that wanted to be on camera talking about for the Olympics. So it does speak for a certain bias for that video too, but at least it's a nice one. It's a gentle one. If you put a political terms like it's not a huff piece. It's not a piece that's made to slander the other opponent. It's made to just make you look better and just talk about rainbows and clouds and talk about unicorns. That's what that video is.
Yeah, there's no costing talked about in the first video. We'll focus on the first one for a second. The music's playing. The music is manipulative. It's uplifting. It's chariots of fire stuff, right? Yeah. Absolutely. And it's trying to invoke how you feel when you watch the Olympics, how you feel when your hometown athlete wins, how you feel, with the idea of having the world come and tell you that your town is amazing. I mean, think about the Vancouver and all. What do we remember from Vancouver 5 years later here in Canada? We don't necessarily remember specific results. I mean, those of us that follow it closely do, of course, but the general public, they'll talk about Sidney Crosby's goal, and they'll probably talk about like how patriotic Canadians were during those 2 weeks, how many flags were on the streets of Vancouver, how many people packed bars to watch the gold medal hockey game final, and just in general how we were winning. Not winning specific things, but in general, because it felt good, and that's what they're trying to invoke. They're trying to invoke the feel good, and they're not talking about costing. They're not talking about direct benefits, which, on one hand, I'll give them a little bit of credit. One of my biggest criticisms of the pro arguments is when they try and argue financial benefit, and it's not really there. Like we fully admit that. Even though we are moderately pro-Olympic on this side when it comes to bids, we're not blindly so, and we understand that when you're making arguments that are suggesting that you're going to make millions of dollars for billions of dollars even for a city that that's kind of a bit of an exaggeration. They're not making those claims in that, so I'll give them that much credit, but it's still ultimately a manipulative message that they're trying to get out there to try and simplify it as much as possible. I like sports and I like the home team, so therefore I'm cheering for Team Boston 2024.
Yeah, and if you're looking at the No Boston Olympic video now, they singled out people. They probably only took the ones that fit their narrative. So the one that didn't know what a velodrome was. First of all, who calls it a cycling stadium? Just the way they said cycling stadium, for me, was a cycling fan. They denigrated the sport just the way they said it. They clearly had a against cycling point of view just in the way they said cycling stadium. Just with that, it was too biased for me and it made me angry watching it. You could hear my commentary when I was watching it, and yet I was really mad watching it just because it makes no sense. There's reasons why you should be against the Olympic movement, but it shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be made that way, and it just made me against that movement just because of that commercial, Duane.
Yeah.
It had the opposite effect that it was supposed to have.
Yeah, and clearly you're not the audience, but
Clearly I'm not from Boston, yeah. I like cycling.
My issue with this, and I think I did actually ask Chris Dempsey this when I had him on, and maybe not as directly as this, but I did certainly ask a question that spoke to this idea, is my issue with it that commercial and others like it is it's kind of condescending towards sports fans. It's kind of condescending towards anyone that would find value to a velodrome, that would find value in having a sports infrastructure improved in a general sense. It's condescending towards those that like cycling because it's different. It's not, if they were talking and went up to the same people and asked whether the affordable, first off, it's a leading question. I think we don't need to explain that. Obviously, affordable housing is more important than everything, but it's either, I'll get into this in a minute. It's not necessarily either or conversation. That's kind of a silly argument to make. But however, if you then had phrased the question a little bit differently, do you think this is more important or renovating Fenway Stadium? Would you think it's more important to do this or make the gardens better, like a sport that matters and has resonance in Boston? If you ask that question with that kind of sport attached to it, is the answer differently? I would say it is. They purposely, in this particular case, picked a sport in cycling and picked a name, and not even just cycling, but indoor cycling, the velodrome cycling, stuff that isn't necessarily appealing to Americans in a general way outside of the every 4 years, and purposely asked it in such a way that made them go, well, that's kind of silly, and why the hell would we want that? Because we don't like that. And that's missing the damn point. As I talk about here in the Pan Am Games all the time, when you hear people that are missing the damn point about sports infrastructure and think it's just about those 2 weeks. And that's the other thing they're doing. They're stripping it down to the 2 week period and ignoring the rest of the soft benefit. And again, it's a soft benefit, not a hard benefit, that will come from having increased sports infrastructure. You'll have more, you ask that same question 10, 20 years after a Boston Olympics, and probably most people know what a velodrome is because there's one next door.
Just a quick example to explain your point that you just said. The Montreal Olympics 76, to this day, there is infrastructure that is still in use. If you talk about the Olympic pool center, the gym and all that, and it's affordable. People that live in that area, which is not a wealthy area, can go train there for about $15, $20 a month, Duane, whenever they want. And that is because of the Olympics in 76. Yes, it's a soft benefit, but if you're asking the population that lives close to the Olympic Stadium right now, they are really happy with that benefit because they can train, they can get healthier. And at that training center, there's nutrition guides, there's nutritionists working there too. So you get almost the same environment that an athlete does, but for $15, $20 a month for Mr. Anybody out there. So it is a soft benefit, but it's really useful for the people that live close to it right now. So I think that illustrates your point really easily.
Yeah, look, I'm not delusional or naive here. You can't change the narrative on how political issues are talked about, particularly in the United States, but all over the world, really. The black and white, right-left kind of dichotomy has been something that's evolved since the late 70s, early 80s. It's really actually the Olympic movement has a role here in the history of these kind of black and white arguments. When you look at the Denver 76 bid, which ultimately was pulled, the Winter Games in 1976 were supposed to go to Denver, but the opposition groups there were so organized and so effectively used this kind of scare, sort of divide and conquer wedge issue sort of tactics that the games ended up, Denver threw the keys on the table and said someone else take them. Which is, would never happen in the modern Olympics. And it's one of the reasons why some of the provisions the IOC puts forward there are so strong and were so got out of control is because of the 76 experience. And that opposition back then we would have called it neocons or now it was very much cost based, very much like this is expensive and we must, not have our taxes go up and not spend public money on this sort of stuff, blah, blah, blah. It's a very right-wing kind of approach. Now it's sort of shifted full circle, and often the opposition comes from more of a left-wing perspective. We shouldn't be spending money on this, and there's more important social issues that we need to deal with. And all of these things are relevant and right things to have conversations about. But my argument, as I just made, is we're not having conversations about them. We're simply screaming our points at each other and trying to make fun of the other side to the point that no one hears anyone that doesn't agree with them. And to me, this is an issue that pisses me off on so many different levels. Anyway, the last point I wanted to make on this, Kevin, and I sort of touched on this a minute ago, is the either-or argument, the bread not circuses argument.
I agree with you, because just quickly, where do the athletes sleep? And that can become affordable housing right after the Olympics. So here's to that. Or a velodrome can become affordable housing if you want to keep that velodrome with the same purpose that it was built for.
That's the cheapest condos to buy in town here, the Pan Am Games, although they're not that cheap because they're in Toronto. But at any rate,
still $1 million.
Yeah, the bread not circuses argument. I want to touch on some real data here just to put this in full perspective. And again, I want to stress that it is important to have priority conversations when you're talking about government spending. It always is. Of course it is. I am not blindly supporting the idea of spending money on sports. I am just simply not also blindly opposed to the spending money on sports because it has a value that can't be identified with dollars and cents. But to put some dollars and cents on it, when you're looking at 2010, these are precise numbers from Vancouver. The total spending from the British Columbia government, I'm just using the provincial side here because I'm going to use healthcare as the other example, and I'm going to use healthcare provincial spending, so it's a direct dollar for dollar thing. In 2010, for the bleed up into 2010, the BC government spent $925 million directly on Olympic spending. That's a lot of money. It's almost $1 billion, and I don't think anyone's going to suggest that's not a lot of money. Now, the argument from the bread not circuses type people is that money should be better spent on something else, that they should then directly take that and put it somewhere. I don't necessarily think it happens that way. However, let's just pretend it did. The following year, the following budget after the Olympics, the British Columbia government spent $15.5 billion on healthcare. So when you look at the $925 million and compare it to $15.5 billion, which is a typical annual spending on healthcare, it's really not directly affecting it very much. It's about 3 weeks of spending on healthcare in the British Columbia. That's what we're talking about, and it's not even necessarily coming from the same fund. That $925 million probably went into different levels of government for different kinds of spendings that were very similar to what the Olympics were. Maybe tourism budget got a bit of a boost, things like that. So it's not necessarily...
Or special programs or special sports. There's a lot of... It's called fund reallocation. It's not necessarily cutting in everywhere else just to fund one particular Olympic project. Now, usually, like you just said, they take... I remember in Quebec, and when talked about the Quebec City Games in 96, and even after that in 2002, and they're still talking about having the games, well, they said they would take funds that were supposed to be allocated to, example, renovate... They were already allocated to renovate certain parts of the universities, infrastructures, and stuff like that would be used after the game and would be needed to do anyways. They would use those funds and rethink the way they would do it. So usually it's a reallocation of existing funds and projects.
Fair enough, yeah. All right, my final thought on this, Kevin, is that these type of conversations are complicated, and the no Boston Olympics people may be right. It may be wrong for Boston to host these Olympics. It absolutely might be wrong. It absolutely might be the wrong thing for the region, for the people of the region. And it's ultimately a conversation that needs to be mostly held there. But I don't say that it's universally always wrong, and that's always been my point on this issue. And you need to have a more nuanced conversation about all of this if you're going to have a fair conversation. I don't have much hope that that's going to happen, but that's my message.
And yeah, and I get behind that message, Duane.
Let's take a quick break. We're going to come back and we're going to have a little bit of soccer conversation in the middle. And welcome back. We're going to lighten the mood a little bit after that and have a conversation about soccer. Real quick one. The U17 qualifying is well underway for the World Cup, which is taking place in October, as well as I said off the top. The final sort of events of the year are taking place in the pre-tournament stuff before the Women's World Cup. So we're just touch base real quick and do a little bit of an update there before we break and come back for our curling update. Here in Concacaf, and I'm going to start there because the Canadian team, and we are a Canadian show, as everyone pretty much knows by now, is doing quite well. They're undefeated going into their final game of the group stage.
Wow,
if they win,
I never heard that before. Canada undefeated in the same sentence.
Well, yeah, and that includes a game against Mexico. And for those that don't know, Mexico is very good at the U17 level. They won the World Cup at U17s 2 cycles ago. They finished runners-up last cycle. So for Canada to get a draw against that and be co-leaders going into the final game of that group stage is quite a remarkable accomplishment for those young men who are mostly from the TFC and Vancouver Whitecaps Academy. And we had a conversation on another show about how there's no Impact Academy players on there, and we won't go into that right now. But that's a domestic conversation.
Yeah, you said you're going to lighten the mood, not dampen it. So
yeah. Well, we don't know, and I said that someone asked me today. I mean, we don't know at the U17 level, and this is an overall conversation to have anyways. You just can't predict. It's hard to really tell, and it is entirely possible that the Impact kids are just a bit behind. Now, it seems beggars belief a little bit, but at the same time, you just don't know. At any rate, so what happens in that game today is they play tomorrow, pardon me. If Canada were to beat Panama in their final game of the group, Panama is in 4th in the group. They're eliminated now. And Mexico and Costa Rica were to draw, or Canada were to turn around a massive goal differential, so it's unlikely, but if they were to say Costa Rica were to, I don't know, they'd have to win by like 12 goals, basically. Canada would, so let's just not worry about that side of it. But if that were to happen, Canada, the draw or the loss by the Mexicans and Canada wins, then Canada would qualify directly to the World Cup. Otherwise, and the more likely scenario, because Mexico is quite a good team, and I think that probably Costa Rica will lose that game. Canada beat Costa Rica earlier in the tournament. That Canada would then have a one-off game to qualify for the World Cup. There are 6 teams still in contention for 4 spots in CONCACAF. That is the USA, Jamaica, Honduras, which are the hosts of this tournament, Mexico, Canada, as we've said, and Costa Rica. 4 of those 6 teams will qualify to Chile, which is in October, and we will be watching that closely. And if you want more specific, more detailed updates from that, you can always listen to our Two Saltitudes podcast, where we will most certainly be talking about Canada's effort in our next show there.
So just to put that in perspective, before the beginning of the tournament, Sean Fleming and the organization of the U17 team talked about how it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard to qualify. Nobody expected those results that they had in the last week that made them almost top, but not made them, they're top of the table in the qualifying group. So it's really surprising, really unexpected results for Canada.
Absolutely, and it's a good result. It's hard to say. We had Daniel Squizzato as a friend of ours on the soccer side of things on our last Two Saltitudes, who talked about how it's important to keep U17 results in perspective. I touched on that a moment ago. But at the same time, this would be the 3rd straight cycle that Canada had qualified for the U17s after a decade-plus absence from the tournament. I think that is a sign that there is improvement slowly happening within the system. It's a long way back from how low Canada got, but we do have some hope there.
And it's a sign too, Duane, that the problem is not at U17 level. It gets trickier when they get older. That's what the problem is.
You have to bridge the gap. You can have some raw talent at U17s, but if you don't have the place for them to play, place for them to develop, and proper domestic quotas, and that's a topic that I belabor to death on another show.
Let's not get into this.
For them to rely upon to get the playing time that they need to develop into full professionals, then you are never going to get past the U17 level of success. And maybe we'll just rename the Canadian National Soccer Program the Canadian National Under-17 Soccer Program, and we'll all be happier. Real quickly, Kevin, there are currently 10 teams that have qualified already for the World Cup in October. Of course, the host Chile is one of them. Australia, North Korea, South Korea, Syria, which is a bit of a different one there. Guyana, Mali, Nigeria, and South Africa. Out of Africa and New Zealand is the Oceania champion, as they generally are by default. And Chile joins that, so we'll have 4 more teams to round that out. The UEFA qualifying is in May of this year, and Canova qualifying is currently going on. It is pretty wide open after 2 group stages. It's hard to really pick any favorites other than to say that there's no one's pulling away early. Ecuador, in fact, is leading one of the groups down there. So
Wow.
Non-traditional powers, which you'll often see in the U17s for a lot of different reasons. mostly the biggest reason is that if you look in UEFA and Knoble, that those young players will often, particularly in Knoble, be playing fully professional for club teams, and those club teams will not necessarily release them for qualifying because they want to develop them in their own club system for financial reasons, really, because they're going to sell them on Knoble, and that's a big business, of course. So you wouldn't put too much stock in the long term when you look at Knoble and UEFA, but certainly from a CONCACAF perspective, it is good news that Canada could play so equally, so well against the defending champions from 2 cycles ago and the runners-up from the last cycle. So we have a little bit of hope there. The other thing I wanted to touch on in the soccer world, Kevin, was the women.
Mm-hmm. The Algarve and Cyprus Cup.
With Cyprus and Algarve. Algarve is the USA has had a bit of a bounce back after the controversy of the fall. Of course, they struggled in a couple friendlies early. The Hope Solo controversy, which for those that don't know, she let her boyfriend get drunk and steal the team van, basically. So that wasn't ideal. She was suspended from the team for a month. She's back with the team. She issued some crocodile tear apology, and here we go. Hope's back in the mix. That is the controversy around the U.S. women's national team. Is it seems like an old girls network where it's hard for anyone to break in. It's an older team. It's a team that relies heavily on Abby Wambach, which is the all-time leading scorer on the women's side of things. They have been struggling against the bigger clubs, and they will have a chance. It's currently ongoing. I think it may have started a few minutes ago, or if not, in a couple minutes as we're taping this. By the time you listen to this, it'll probably be over. But they are currently playing France, which is both Kevin and I's pick, I believe. I don't want to speak for you, Kevin, but it's certainly my pick to be the World Cup champion in Canada at the end of this year. That'll be the second time in a couple months that the U.S. and France have played, so that is a marquee matchup that is taking place as we record this.
No, just a quick note on France, too. That team will have everybody behind them with a tragedy that happened 2 days ago in the Caribbean. And actually, I think it was in South America that happened, that 3 French athletes died in a helicopter crash. So with all that, I think France will be our darling this summer.
Yeah, there's a reality show in Argentina. Yeah. There was a helicopter crash tragedy there. A couple Olympic medalists, a boxer and a swimmer. Names, I don't have them in front of me, so I apologize for that. But they unfortunately passed away in that accident.
Other names, just quickly, Janine Luongo, which is probably the best French cyclist in the feminine side ever in the history of cycling. She's 52 now, and she was the world champion at 50. And she was part of that reality show. And unfortunately, 3 athletes died, but it could have been the potential for a much worse tragedy. So fortunately, a lot of athletes were safe, too, during that tragedy. So our thoughts with the families.
Of course. On the other side of there's no easy segue out of that, so we'll just move on. The Cyprus is where Canada is. Canada has traditionally been in that. They won that tournament several years in a row. They lost it to England last year in the final. Once again, it is a rematch of last year's final. That one is, unfortunately, there's no stream. There's no way for Canadians to watch this. I'd be very interested to watch that game because I think that's going to be very telling about where Canada is in its preparations, because England and Canada were always right there together, and England was the one team that Canada was always just a little bit better than.
Okay.
When you look back to London, the Team GB was Canada beat them in the quarterfinal. It was the most complete game they played in that Olympic tournament. We've talked a lot in the past on many different venues about how Canada, there's a lot of luck in their bronze medal run, but the Team GB win was not one of those luck. But since that Olympics, since London, they've kind of passed. England seems to be a little bit better than Canada now, and I'm very interested to see what the result of that game is. If Canada can beat England and sort of reaffirm themselves as kind of the top of the rest, the best of the second tier, which is kind of what the Canada-England battle always represented to me on the women's side, then it might mean that there's a chance that they could get on an upset run this summer. But if England, puts their foot back down and maintains that best of the rest sort of status, then I think that any chance of a realistic chance of a long and tremendous, glorious run in the Women's World Cup here at home is increasingly becoming less likely. So that's the other game that's taking place today. By the time you listen to this, unless you're a truly dedicated folk, it's probably done, and we'll touch on the results in next week's 5 Rings.
No, yeah, I agree. It's the battle for 4th place in the World Cup, in my opinion. Either Canada or England will be the one step off that podium, and we'll see tonight who's the better team between the two.
All right, fair enough. We'll update again, as I said. That's a bit of a soccer update. I guess real quickly before we go, another game taking place today is Kevin's favorite English team. So how, are you going to watch the second best blue team in England play today?
Well, it's the best team in royal blue. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough.
And probably for sure I'm going to watch it. I'll watch it at home, but I'll watch it for sure against the Frenchman from Paris. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, off record, yeah, this certainly should be an intriguing game, and better than the games we got. Real Madrid made things interesting yesterday in the UEFA Champions League. But at any rate, we were talking off air that the best, in our mind, at least in my mind, the best annual event in world sport is the Champions League final. And that's just, I'm not going to have that debate right now, but it's something for you, the listener, to think about. Let us know if you think that there's a better annual event out there, and maybe that's a topic we'll have down the line when we get closer to the actual Champions League final.
Everybody saw that graphic. It starts with like the Super Bowl, then it goes to Champions League. 700 million people watched the Champions League final or something like that last year. So yeah, it's not like the World Cup final, but it's close to it.
Yeah, and it's a better game than the World Cup final usually. I mean, I don't think I'm talking tales here. People that are listening to this are aware of this, but club football is better than national team football. I mean, that's not something a casual soccer fan understands, but we do. And anyway, I do quite enjoy watching the Champions League. Although I have a funny relationship with it as a Manchester City supporter. It's because it was so much not a competition that for years when I was supporting City, I ever had a chance to even be in. So that now that I'm in it, it just seems like I'm watching through a dream or something. So although when I'm really into it, when it's happening, I don't sit there and fret about it outside of once the 90 minutes is done. I'm like, okay, well, that was fun. We got to the final 16. I'm not one of these guys that's going to worry too much about the fact that City struggles in Europe. And I mean, what does struggles in Europe mean? They're in the final 16 2 years in a row. How struggling really is that?
It's 16 best team in 400 clubs. So yeah. It's still good.
So,
400, that's being that's being low on my estimate.
Anyway, the league's still my gig, so we'll watch the Barcelona game next week and hope for a miracle. If not, then we'll move on. All right, that was more UEFA Champions League than I was going to talk about, so we'll call break now, and we'll come back and we'll have
a curling talk.
Really tough shot. This could be the game here. Great opportunity though. Five rings final stone here in two. It's close. There's a run back. And there's the tap.
Duane talks about curling on the Five Rings podcast.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for Jennifer Jones.
And welcome back to another Duane Talks Curling. Briar wrapped up. The Briar is... we talked last week with Lucas when he came on that it was incredibly competitive and a really interesting week. You had teams, any team could upset anyone. Even the bottom of the draw this week, like the New Brunswicks of the world out there, they were competitive and they were absolutely putting a show on for people. It was, if you're a curling fan, this past week's Briar, you're jonesing for it right now because it was a great competition that was really not that predictable. By and large, Lucas, our guest last week, predicted that it would be a Jacobs Goose final, Newfoundland versus Northern Ontario. He got half of that right, and it certainly did look for a long time that he would be bang on because they were the top two teams throughout the week. However, in the final, it ended up being John Morris is who started the week as a skip, and we'll get into that in a minute. It was Pat Simmons that skipped that team at the end of the year, but Team Canada, at any rate, the defending champions, minus one player, got back to the final and ultimately did defeat Brad Jacobs 6-5. The Olympic gold medalist fell 6-5 to the defending Briar champions in what was a really intriguing, what was a kind of a cagey match through 7 ends, and then it really opened up. And it was 2-0 after 7 ends, 2-0. My soccer talk's coming up, and then it ended up being 6-5. So with a big take of 3. It was the only time Jacobs gave up 3 in an end. All competition in the 8th end to take the 5-3 lead. They ended up getting the deuce in the 10th to force the extra end, but it's always a challenge when you don't have hammer in the final end. But in the end, Canada got the single in the final end and won 6-5. Pat Simmons was the skip of that. after switching with John Morris midweek, we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Carlton Rycroft and Nolan Thiessen being the front end of that rink. They are back-to-back champions, minus one player. Was the topic going into the week, was the Kevin Coey, the Alberta rink, who was the skip of the Team Canada last year when they were Team Alberta. And he dropped his players, dropped those three guys, said they weren't good enough. Well, final laugh went to who, Kevin?
Guess they were good enough, right?
Yeah, they absolutely were. It was interesting, and as I said, I alluded to this a minute ago. John Morris is the 2010 gold medalist as a third from Vancouver, so this is a very talented curler. But he had been mostly taking the year off, concentrating on local spiels out there, money spiels occasionally here and there, but mostly focusing on his career as a firefighter. He jumped in and was going to skip that rink, but not even full halfway through the rink when they were 2 and 3. Early on, they had a meeting. They had a team meeting, and they decided that Pat Simmons, who was the third, was going to bump up and throw skip rocks and actually be the skip, actually call the game, and that John Morris would go back into his more comfortable role as a third, which, again, he won a gold medalist at the Olympics at. And once they did that, it was a different Team Canada, and they became right up there near the top, and they will be representing Canada at the World Championship in Halifax, where they'll be looking to avenge a disappointing world title last year. So
one quick question for you. Is there such a thing as home advantage in curling?
Not necessarily at the world's level, because the rinks are in the big. You talked about this with Lucas last week. You're talking about arena ice, right? It's, in this particular case, it'd be at the Convention Center in Halifax, is where the Mooseheads play, the junior hockey team. So you're looking at, it's a hockey rink that's been made into a curling rink for the week. There would be home advantage at your local curling club when you're used to the certain ice, you're used to the draws, you're used to the weights. It's like a golf green. Curling ice like a golf green, right? Like it has its own quirks and so on and so forth. So if you run the same one all the time, you have an advantage. But when you're going into a neutral one, not necessarily. But the home crowd, I mean, they're going to hammer their cowbell harder for you, I guess. I don't know if that pumps you up or even being pumped up's good in curling. I don't know. It's one of those inverted U sports where you don't want to get too over the side of it and make things worse. But we digress.
Shot. Drink a game. Here's a shot.
Yeah. I mean, that's what there was. It was a good game. It was an entertaining game for a lot of people to watch. And I think that the storyline is an interesting one. And it's the first time that a Team Canada had been in the Brier, and they won it. That shows the advantage of being able to pair all year for the Brier is going to be something to look at. If you look on the women's side, on the Scottish side, Team Canada does very well year after year. They often will win it. They will, once a team gets a hold of the prize, it's hard to knock them off the top of the hill. So it'll be interesting to watch in the years ahead to see whether the Team Canada concept in the men's side will have the same sort of pull that it does on the women's side.
Absolutely, and it's going to be interesting to see who's if they can win the worlds, both on the men and the women. It's because what's the percentage? It's more than half the time that it's been Canadian champions, right?
Yeah, it's been in recent years. It's been less prominent. Canada has, I wouldn't say struggled. They're always competitive. They're often medal, but they have not dominated the way they did in the past in the last few years, because the rest of the world at the elite top of the heap side of things is catching up a little bit. But that said, and this is a good segue, the World Junior Championships were held last week, and double gold for Canada.
There you go.
Women's side was Kelsey Rock was the winner there. Kelsey won her second straight World Junior Championship. She went 11-0. Was the second time that a female rank went perfect at the Worlds. She won the final over Scotland 8-2. It wasn't the dominant rink all week. Absolutely the best junior curler in the world on the female side there by far. Now, my favorite part about the men's side, they weren't quite as dominant, but they did win. They won 6-3 in the final. Brendan Calvert was the name of the young skip that won that. And he was asked, and this is one of my absolute favorite sports quotes of maybe ever. He was asked immediately after winning the world championship in his sport what the first thing he was going to do, how he was going to celebrate this when he got home. And his answer was, "I'm going to go home and see the new cows that were born while I was gone."
That's a Canadian answer if there's ever been one.
Yeah, he's going to go look at his new heifers, man. And that is the most hilarious Canadian curling quote of all time. And I just had to laugh when I heard that. But congratulations to him, regardless. And I hope his cows are healthy and live a strong milk-producing life, because it's perfect. Anyway.
Hey, we can't top this, Dwayne, so I think we need to stop the show right now.
You want to stop there? Okay. Yeah, sure. That's fine. The quick note, though, that the Women's World Championship starts this week. We will wrap that up in our next curling talk. In the meantime, Kevin, you can say goodbye.
Well, take care of your cows. They're borns as well. And we'll talk to you soon on the Five Rings Podcast on your podium, folks. Patreon.com, 2 Solitudes, 5 Rings.
Well, I'm so proud of the guys. They went out there and they shot the lights out, and it's a dream come true for all of us.
So what's the first thing you're going to do when you get home?
I'm probably going to go see the new calves being born at home, and then we're probably going to celebrate with all our family and supporters back home. It's unbelievable how many people are probably watching right now and cheering us on.